Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today, we are here with Michael Kill, CEO, Nighttime Industries Association in the United Kingdom. Michael is a true advocate with real world experience of operating venues. He took on the government forces during COVID lockdowns and now the impacts from rising energy costs, labor shortages, and tax burdens on the many small independent bars, pubs, and clubs.
Hey, Michael, great to talk with you. I'm so glad that you're taking the time. You're a really busy guy, and I've been really admiring the work that you've been doing. But before we begin, I'd like to just get you to give a little bit of background. How did you get to be in this place? I mean, when you were 18 years old, did you ever think you would be doing this?
Funny enough, no. I was probably the furthest from it. I actually, my focus was to become a physiotherapist and go into the medical profession. So it was completely different. I almost fell into hospitality and late night economy. I was working in the theatre and literally came back from the theatre in London, working in the Fringe, got a bar job, and it was almost like 20 years later. I'm doing festivals, events, going through the process of running clubs, working for corporates, independents, owning my own venue. I culminated in getting to this point, which is super exciting to be able to give something back, which is how I see my role these days.
Oh, so you kind of evolved into the association role, more or less to take your collective experience and say, how can I help other people? Is that how you ended up doing this work?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I started on the bar, working on the bar like many sort of really good sort of operators. Then the
Mhm.
bar, then I sort of did a lot of hospitality work. Then I became a promoter, worked in marketing. I started moving into the sort of blue chip marketing sort of era. Came out of that, became a general manager. So I've been an operator at heart. I've been someone who's actually dealt with the floor.
Mhm.
And then I sort of built up in those corporate environments. But when I broke away from corporates, obviously that's where you learn all your lessons. So, when you have that corporate shield of working with a big company, you're somewhat protected. The systems are in place. And then when you own your own bar, it's almost like, right, I've got to do that now. I've got to do that as well. Oh, wow, right, okay. So I haven't got someone who can help me. Who does my insurance? How does the license happen? So,
Mhm.
the biggest learning curve I had was coming away from a corporate, which is somewhat shielded, and started to sort of work in different environments. And my last few roles have been exec roles, looking at groups of businesses. And then I was the commercial director for the student union in Norwich, which was one of the biggest student union licensed spaces at 5,000 that I looked after late in my career. And then I was offered the opportunity at the trade association. So started working in the back, working at infrastructure and how
Mhm.
things work. And then slowly grew. And if I'm going to be really, really honest with you, when we got to a point where I took over as CEO, the pandemic hit. And
Wow.
the pandemic almost, it was make or break. And I remember the first interview I had on television and the first meetings that were really sort of ingratiated in terms of talking about pandemic. And they were a huge learning curve. And
Mhm.
since then, we've really harnessed the media, harnessed representation in terms of government and all the different departments, and it's grown from there. But it's
Mhm.
it's it's not been easy. Not been
Well,
easy. It's
it's like NEVA in the US, the National Independent Venues Association. They really didn't have much going on. In fact, I think they formed and grew exponentially because they had to lobby Congress to get the funding, and that network is still around. Rev Moose is on our planning group for the summit, um, and so they've had their first conference, and they seem to be becoming a viable entity too. Um, yeah, it's
well,
interesting that you bring that personal perspective, because I think in order to be truly representative of the industry, you have had to like wash dishes, and that's my own personal experience. Just as a background, I helped to open a nightclub music venue in New York back in 1972. Later went on to open up a restaurant in Pittsburgh, and And, so I have that basic understanding of what it takes to walk through all of the things like, getting the license, getting the insurance, dealing with workers' comp, all of those things that most people don't think about. So that's how you seem to be advocating for the businesses even today, where you're looking at more or less the independent business operator and looking at the cost of energy and the tax and the impacts of Brexit, um, in terms of getting labor. Where you had a big immigrant population that helped with labor, and now you have a shortage in that area. So how did your association work through COVID, and particularly what you saw as a former business operator, how to prioritize what their needs were?
I think the biggest thing that we took away from this, and the biggest thing that we established was to our benefit, was to establish a community of support. I think one of the things that people felt was many of them were very independent. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't, everyone was sort of anticipating the next press conference, which would have let them know exactly what was happening. And what we quickly established was a very clear communication strategy with government and the link to the wider community within the sector. And we had to acknowledge the fact that we had to open the doors to people who needed support. So we sort of stripped away the position in terms of membership. We just opened the doors to everyone to be able to be part of things like WhatsApp groups and social media sort of networks, to ensure that there was that opportunity for everyone to engage and talk about best practice, because everyone was very isolated. And that was our biggest stance, is community and communication pathways. They were the two biggest challenges that we had in terms of establishing our position. From that point on, then we had a route to market in terms of understanding what people needed. We worked very hard in terms of things like impact assessment, case studies, and at every point that the government engaged with us in terms of the next stage of this pandemic, we were able to turn around statistics and evidence that would substantiate and have a greater consideration in terms of government policy making. So a lot of work that we did was about ensuring that we had a direct link in to businesses that could give us direct feedback. And that was such a really important piece to influencing how the government moved forward. We didn't always get what we wanted, but what we did is we represented very strongly across multiple departments, from business to culture to treasury to they call it Department of Levelling Up, but also things like Home Office that deal with our licensing regime. So there was a lot of work that was put in, and it was constant. It was almost, we had WhatsApp groups with the best part of 2,500 businesses plus that we were talking to all the way through till the early hours of the night. We were dealing with people's well-being. We were dealing with issues that people had, like debt and ways of applying for grants or funding. So all of this was managed through communication platforms, and we gave people as much support as possible. And it really allowed us to flourish. It allowed us to move forward and become an integral part. And we still have those networks that we work and have grown today, and have really established the NTIA as a formidable group that has a very clear understanding of what's going on at ground level. Because we always had this impetus, is I would rather manage from the ground up than the top down. And because I was an operator at heart, I always had that. I've been on the bar, I've stood on the front door, I know what it's like to be operating a business, I know what the financial pressures are, and I can communicate that with government in a way that the operator will feel that they're truly represented by someone who understands the challenges they have.
So one thing is, technology has certainly changed the way in which associations operate, because traditionally that kind of network would have been at your annual convention, the one time where people are physically together, where they can network and sit and, drink until 3 o'clock in the morning and share war stories and everything else. But what you're saying is technology kind of, in one small way, perhaps, because you can never replace that physical interaction, but it did create a communication network that wouldn't have been possible even 5 years ago. And then secondly, it seems this opened the doors for people to recognize that they don't have to work alone, that they can depend upon each other and that asking for help from other business operators doesn't necessarily mean you're working to help your competitors, but rather you're working towards a common goal. And those are
Exactly.
some of the things that I got from what you just said. Is that kind of a good
Yeah, very
analysis?
much so. I mean, I think the one thing that we took from it was we could pivot very quickly. So, for instance, if the government came out and said, look, we need to understand how this would impact nightclubs if we put these measures in, we could then quickly bring together nightclubs onto a webinar and start working with government to truly give feedback so people had a clear understanding of what the impacts would be. So, but yeah, I mean, you've nailed it pretty much. It was about breaking barriers down. It was about competitors working together with a mutual cause, which was about surviving this pandemic. And, you know, we all took an equal part in trying to drive this forward. And there were many, many people that came out, you know, as real credible mentors that helped each other across a multitude of groups and of communication, which was vitally important for us and the industry as a whole.
I read all kinds of numbers about the numbers of venues that have closed, or, especially the large capacity venues oriented to music and entertainment, and not being able to open up, or they don't have the resources, or the customers are not as oriented to that type of a space.
Yeah.
They're looking for more intimate spaces. So, or festivals, which seem to be a younger generation way to socialize. So how has the industry adapted or changed, and how is the consumer influencing that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to take away from that. I mean, initially, come the 19th of July, when the doors were all open last year, there was a flood back. Without a doubt, we saw 18 to 25-year-olds come back quite vociferously. There was no issue with their return. What's happened over the course of the last sort of 12 months is there was a tentative notion over Christmas, which is obviously a critical period for the sector, that golden quarter leading up to the New Year's Eve. We found that the government had played a card in sort of taking away some confidence in people coming out at Christmas, particularly the early part of Christmas, where you saw pubs, restaurants, etc., benefit from bookings. But what we then came out of as we moved past that Christmas period is a very tough January and February. And now we've moved into a year where the overseas crisis, Brexit, and the culmination of a position around cost inflation has now almost double dipped us. It's got us to a point where we've gone from one crisis to another. The challenge we have here is the position that we've undertaken is much more critical, because at the moment, with inflation going up, with the cost of energy going up almost 800 to 1,000%, businesses are being crippled. And we lost during the pandemic something 1 in 3 nightclubs. We've lost 2,200 pubs in the last few weeks. So for us, we were getting to a critical point, and we needed government to step up. And what they did with the mini budget of recent, they delivered an energy cap process, or a subsidy process, but still at the point of 300 to 400% of previous bills. So as you can understand, the direct and indirect cost implications of that, whether you're a supplier who passes it on or your direct position in terms of energy, just kept that pressure up. And what we've seen recently is businesses are about 15% down on 2019. They're about 30% plus up in terms of their costs. And now we're facing a alcohol duty position, which, if we do not increase our costs on product, we'll see a 10% loss in our liquor margin, or our profit margin in terms of wet sales. So we're in almost a perfect storm. The challenge that we've got is there's only so far that you can pass on. So in terms of customer behavior, there's 2 things that have happened. There has been almost a drive in antisocial behavior and people's frustrations. I don't know whether that's an economic frustration in terms of people coming out and getting quite frustrated with the current environment. And then the other thing is we're still suffering from this legacy of things like no-shows and cancellations, particularly in a restaurant world, and particularly in the event sector, that has really sort of presented some challenges. Although people will pay for their ticket, we're now seeing, even with freshers or the student period each year where we see freshers return, that was almost like it would normally be a couple of weeks worth of trade. It's literally been a weekend and a couple of days, and it's almost a flash in the pan. So we can clearly see the impact of less disposable income, and we can see the frustrations of the economic pressures that people are under. And there is a big gap between the sort of mid to late 20s through to mid to late 30s who are not coming out because they've got more financial responsibility than most.
Moving forward, how do you see your organization? I mean, these are so dramatically outside of the control of any individual or any organization or any kind of governmental entity. I know here in the US, everybody's trying to blame Biden for all of these problems, but it seems it's a massive, on a massive scale throughout the world. So how do you see an association like yours, dealing with this? I think you've begun to do some of that work through your work on changing some of the energy, but moving forward, how do you see this all coming together? And you don't work alone. Obviously, we talk about the night mayor or the Office of Nightlife or whatever it is. And you're like one part of a whole system. So moving forward, how do you see all of these pieces really interacting with each other to help the business sector? And then in particular, what have you learned from what's going on in the US, and what do you think the US is learning from you?
Well, I think the one thing that we have, the NTI has probably been one of the strongest advocates for nighttime economy advisors and night czars in the UK. We were actively involved in Amy taking her role, Sasha Lord taking his role in Manchester, and more recently the Carly Heath, who took her role in Bristol. We've now just confirmed that West Midlands, Birmingham, is going to be taking on a nighttime economy advisor. So for us, I mean, that's such a vital role for major cities up and down the country, and it has a formidable role to play in terms of celebrating nighttime economy, both economically, community-based and cultural-based, but also on an international basis, it gives us a footing in terms of people talking about the major cities and the important part that we play. I think the one challenge that we've had all along here is our government lacks education on our industry. And one of the big things that we've been battling since the start of the pandemic is, alongside lobbying for support, we have done a retrospective amount of work in trying to encourage people to really understand the strength and depth of our sector as a whole. So ministers have for a long time thought that a nightclub is more like Saturday Night Fever compared to what it looks like now. And we have commercial venues which are more sort of akin to social and celebratory experiences, as much as we have electronic dance music and live music within these venues and hybrid spaces. So we've spent a lot of time educating the government, and some of this is leading towards representation in central government, which will allow us to join the networks in the nighttime economy advisors from all the different varying cities and locations, so that we've got a more joined up collaborative approach to the way that we look at nighttime economy and particular hospitality as a whole. And we've talked about hospitality ministers in many roles. Some ministers have advocated for that, some haven't. But I think the big thing that we've taken, and the one thing that is a big driver, and I take from people like Ariel Politz, who has been an amazing advocate for New York with the nightlife office, and we've had Ariel come to us a few times, but some of the work that she's done on training and advocacy on how she's managed a very difficult situation where I always sit back as we have somewhat been quite lucky in being able to influence to a point what support that we can get. Although, as you can appreciate with any government, they can only go so far. What I've really enjoyed seeing, particularly in America, is a very, very different approach and looking at what the industry can do to change what's going on within their environments, not so much relying on the government to do something about their environments. And I think the narrative for us, the learning for us in terms of the US, and from what I've seen in terms of feedback, is there's a lot of work proactively driving a way of changing what's happening. And I give you an example, real simple example. We talk about an energy subsidy for the challenges that we have for elevating costs. At no point was anyone talking about, why don't we actually speak to the businesses about refining their energy use or consumption? Why don't we talk about restructuring their businesses? Why don't we talk about ways that we can refine or look at different energy sources that might be more effective, or ways that we can manage that make it very clear? Now, everything is driven because we've become almost cultured around going to government for support. We've got a part to play in that as well. And that's something that I've definitely taken from the US in terms of, let's get our office in order and our ducks in line, and then go out once we've considered every option that we have, because I think that's a really important thing that possibly British culture and British sort of hospitality and late night economy doesn't so proactively do or try to drive towards. And not all environments, will allow that, but definitely it's something that I've taken from the US, alongside, the community aspects that we've seen and shared right the way across the world.
Well, this has been great. You're quite a great speaker. You went longer than my scheduled time, and I probably could go another hour with you. So you're very articulate, a great ambassador for your cause, and I look forward to seeing you in New York next year.
Amazing. And Jim, look, I'm looking forward to meeting you properly and taking you out for a bit of dinner and continuing our conversation. So thanks.
All right.